That iconic sound, the familiar animation of Mario shrinking and falling off the screen, and then the life counter decreases from 3 to 2. It's a moment of tension every gamer knows all too well. But have you ever stopped to ask why 3 lives? Why not 5 or just 1? Or even infinite tries from the start? Today, we are diving deep into one of gaming's most fundamental yet rarely questioned conventions, the 3 life system that Mario helped popularize. We will explore its historical origins, the technical and design considerations behind it, the psychology it creates, and how it shaped game design for decades. What might seem like a simple gameplay mechanic opens up fascinating discussions about game design philosophy, psychology, cultural symbolism, and the evolution of player expectations. So power up with the mushroom and jump right in. To understand why Mario has 3 lives, we must travel back to the arcades in the late 70s and early 80s. Arcade games were designed with a clear business model: get players to insert more coins. As game designer Eugene Jarvis, the creator of Defenders and Robotron, once explained, the business reality was simple. You needed to make a quarter last about 90 seconds for the average player. Too short, player feel cheated. Too long, and the arcade owners aren't making enough money. This economic model fundamentally shaped game design. Games needed to be challenging enough that players would fail regularly but not so difficult that they would give up entirely. The limited life system struck this delicate balance perfectly. Space Invaders, related in 1978, gave players 3 ships, effectively 3 lives. Pac-Man, released in 1980, also provided players with 3 lives. This wasn't coincidental, it was an industry standard that evolved from extensive player testing and economic optimization. When Shigeru Miyamoto and his team at Nintendo began developing Donkey Kong in 1981, Mario's first appearance, they built upon these established conventions. The standard was typically 3 lives. And then, interesting thing happened when Nintendo transitioned from arcades to home consoles with the Famicom, NES in the West. Despite no longer needing to extract quarters from players, they maintained the 3 life system. You may want to ask why? Part of the answer lies in technical limitations. The NES had just 2 kilobytes of RAM. That's about 1/500,000th of what modern gaming systems have. Miyamoto has discussed in interviews how memory constraints affected many design decisions, where he says, "We were always working with limitations. Memory was precious, and we had to make tough choices about what to include." 3 lives represented a perfect middle ground from a technical perspective. It was enough to give players a fair chance while maintaining the challenge, and the binary counter could easily represent 0 to 3 lives with minimal memory usage. David Sheff's book, Game Over: How Nintendo Conquered the World, details how these technical constraints shaped Nintendo's early game designs, where he says, every bit of code, every pixel, every game mechanics had to earn its place. Nothing could be wasted in those early games. Beyond memory constraints, processing limitations also influenced the life system. Each time Mario died, the level would reset, a much less demanding process than creating complex checkpoint system that would require additional memory to track player progress within levels. Dr. Mark Wolf notes in The Medium of the Video Game that these technical limitations often led to creative solutions that become gaming conventions in their own rights. 3 life system also created a consistent player experience. In an era before save systems were common, the limited life system created natural gaming sessions with clear beginning and ending. If you lost all your lives, the game was over, creating a complete narrative arc for each play session. Nintendo's hardware and software design philosophy emphasized elegant simplicity, doing more with less. The 3 life system exemplifies this approach, creating depth through simple mechanics rather than complexity through elaborate systems. Beyond the technical and business considerations, the 3 life system represents a deliberate game design philosophy. In their influential book, Rules of Play, game design theorists Katie Sellen and Eric Zimmerman discuss how punishment mechanics serve crucial functions, where they say meaningful play emerges from systems where player actions have discernible and disintegrated consequences. Without the risk of failure, success loses its meaning. Mario's limited life system creates what scholars call weighted consequences. Each jump over a pit carries real stakes. Each encounter with a Goomba matters. This transforms what might otherwise be routine actions into moments of tensions and excitement. Game designer and scholar Jasper Juhl categorizes different types of punishment in his work Punishment in Video Games. He identifies the loss of life as a setback punishment that doesn't permanently hinder progress but forces players to repeat a gameplay section. This repetition serves multiple purposes. First is a teaching mechanism, as Juhl explains, where he says, punishment isn't just negative reinforcement, it is a feedback system that guides players towards mastery. When you lose a life to a particular obstacle, you'll likely approach it differently on your next attempt. Limited lives make each lesson more impactful. This creates a fascinating risk-reward dynamic. The presence of scarce, one-up mushrooms and hidden life-granting secrets encourages exploration and risk-taking, while the fear of losing lives encourages caution. Game designer Jane McGonigal observes in her book Reality is Broken, where she says, good games balance on the edge of what's challenging and what's achievable. They are challenging enough to make victory meaningful, but not so challenging that players give up. The three-life system functions as a perfect pressure value for difficulty. Too easy to complete with one life? The challenge isn't meaningful. Is it too difficult to complete with 3 lives? Players become frustrated and quit. Limited life system also functions as a resource management mechanic. Lives become a precious commodity the players must conserve and strategically spend. Should you risk your current life to reach that tempting one-up mushroom? Is it worth exploring that dangerous-looking pipe for potential reward? Game designer Ernest Adams writes in Fundamentals of Game Design, where he says, resource scarcity creates interesting decisions. When lives are unlimited, the decisions to take risks becomes trivial. When lives are limited, each risk must be carefully weighed. This scarcity creates what economics and game theorist Jasper Koster calls non-trivial choices, decisions with meaningful trade-offs that engage players at a deeper level. When analyzed through the lens of flow theory developed by psychologists Mihaly Csikszentmihalyi, the three-life system helps maintain the delicate balance between anxiety and boredom. With unlimited lives, the tension dissipates with too few and frustration mounts. Over time, Nintendo has adjusted this balance in different Mario games. Super Mario Bros. 3 offered more opportunities to collect extra life, reflecting its increased difficulty. Super Mario World introduced save points, modifying the risk-reward calculation of the life system. Game designer and Nintendo researcher Brendan Keogh notes, Nintendo consistently experiments with the relationship between challenges, punishments, and rewards. The three-life foundation provides a flexible platform that could be tuned for different experiences. Let's explore how the three-life system affects player psychology and why 3 has proven an effective number for the mechanic. The number 3 has practical advantages in game design that make it particularly effective for a life system. One life will be too unforgiving, creating frustration rather than challenge. Players might play too cautiously with just one chance, limiting experimentation and exploration. On the other hand, too many lives could make the game feel inconsequential, removing tension and diminishing the satisfaction of success. Game psychologist Jamie Madigan explains in Getting Gamers, limited life systems create what psychologists call heightened engagement through perceived scarcity. As resources dwindle, attention focuses and emotional investment peaks. What's fascinating is how the three-life system creates a natural psychological arc within each play session. With all 3 lives intact, the early game encourages boldness and experimentation. Players are more willing to take risks, explore optional areas, and test the game's boundaries. When down to 2 lives, we see a shift in behavior. Players become more methodical, weighing risks more carefully, and with just one life remaining, we observe maximum focus and tension. Movements become more deliberate and decisions more conservative. Psychologist Mihaly Csikszentmihalyi's flow theory suggests optimal engagement occurs when challenge and skill are balanced. The three-life system creates a dynamic difficulty adjustment that naturally increases players' focus as lives are lost. The University of Saskatchewan's Human-Computer Interaction Lab found that this increasing tension creates memorable gaming moments. Players rarely remember routine successes, but they vividly recall narrow escapes and moments where they completed difficult sections with their final life. Researcher Regan Mandrick observes, the most emotionally intense gaming moments often occur when players feel most vulnerable. The three-life system manufactures these moments of high emotional intensity. This progression from 3 lives to 1 also creates what psychologists call a near-miss effect. When players come close to failure but survive, they experience a stronger dopamine response than from routine successes. This reinforces continued play and creates more memorable experiences. Cognitive scientists have studied how we process numerical information, finding that humans typically can hold 3 to 4 discrete items in working memory without difficulty. This means 3 lives are easily tracked mentally, allowing players to focus on gameplay rather than resource management. Game designer Ernest Adams writes, "The best game mechanics are those that create meaningful tension without adding cognitive overhead. 3 lives achieves this balance perfectly." The effectiveness of this system is evident in how many games beyond Mario adopted similar framework. From Sonic to Crash Bandicoot, the 3-life structure became a standard that players intuitively understood across different titles and genres. This psychological framework makes the 3-life system more than just a technical solution or business model. It is a carefully calibrated emotional experience that balances tension with opportunity and challenge with accessibility. The 3-life system isn't just a mechanical construct, it can also be interpreted as having narrative significance. In The Hero with a Thousand Faces, Joseph Campbell outlines the monomyth or hero's journey, which frequently involves second chance and multiple attempts. The hero succeeds rarely on their first try. Game narrative researcher Janet Murray suggests in Hamlet on the Holodeck that game mechanics often serve as a procedural metaphors. The ability to try again after failure reflects the resilience required in the hero's journey. From the perspective, Maria's 3 lives represents the narrative trope of the hero's multiple attempts at overcoming adversity. They reflect the learning, adapting, and succeeding process characterizing game master and mythic storytelling. This pattern appears consistently across narrative traditions. In countless folktales, the hero is given 3 tasks or 3 chances. In modern cinema, we often see a rule of 3 in action sequences. The hero fails twice before succeeding on the 3rd attempt. Literary scholar Christopher Booker identifies overcoming the monster as one of the 7 basic plots in his book. Within this structure, the hero typically experiences setbacks before the final confrontation, a pattern neatly embodied by the 3-life system. Some scholars have even connected the 3-life system to the concept of reincarnation and rebirth that appears in many spiritual traditions. After all, Mario returns to try again after death. Comparative mythologist Joseph Campbell notes, the myth of death and rebirth appears in virtually every cultural tradition. It represents the universal human experience of failure, learning, and eventual triumph. The visual transition between lives, Mario shrinking, falling, and reappearing at the start of the level or checkpoint creates a mini-narrative of defeat and resilience, as game studies pioneer Ian Bogos notes. The procedural rhetoric of Mario's death and rebirth cycle communicates a core value: persistence through failure leads to eventual success. Game designer Jesse Schell suggests in The Art of Game Design that this cycle mimics the fundamental learning process. We learn through iteration: try, fail, understand why, try differently, repeat until success. The three-life system embodies a cycle of learning and adaptation. The interpretation frames Mario as not just an avatar for the player but a metaphorical figure whose journey mirrors our struggles to overcome challenges through persistence and adaptation. Even the ultimate game over state carries narrative significance. It represents not a permanent failure but a reset, a chance to begin the journey again with knowledge and skills. As media theorist Mackenzie Wack observes in gamer theory, the game over is never truly over. It is an invitation to try again, to iterate, to perfect. The real game is learning the game itself. This endless cycle of attempt, failure, and reattempt echoes philosopher Albert Camus' interpretation of the myth of Sisyphus, finding meaning in the struggle rather than only in achieving goals. While Mario helped establish the pre-life paradigm, game designers have been experimenting with, evolving, and sometimes abandoning this system in fascinating ways. This classic arcade-style model of limited lives has evolved considerably as gaming culture, technology, and design philosophy has changed. Let's examine how different games approach punishment mechanics and the psychology of failure. The first example is Demon's Souls or Dark Souls. These games reimagined punishment by creating a risk of resource loss rather than a complete restart. As creator Hidetaka Miyazaki explained, we wanted the failure to be impactful without being permanently discouraging. The loss of souls creates tension without blocking progress entirely. The Soul series effectively transformed the punishment mechanics into a risk recovery system. Players don't lose life, but they drop their accumulated currency where they died. They recover everything if they can return to the spot without dying again. This creates intense moment of risk assessment and strategic decision making. Game critic Daniel Friedman observes, Dark Souls' innovation was making death part of the gameplay loop rather than an interruption of it. The recovery mechanic transforms failure into a new challenge rather than punishment. Spelunky embraces permadeath, but makes each playthrough short and varied. Designer Derek Yu notes, when failure means starting over completely, each decision carries maximum weight, but we balance this with procedural generation to ensure each attempt feels fresh. These games effectively flip the Mario paradigm. Instead of giving players multiple chances with a fixed game world, they give players one chance in every changing world. This creates tension and high replayability. Game designer Tom Adams, creator of Dwarf Fortress, explains, permadeath isn't about punishing players. It is about making each moment meaningful. When anything could be your last action, everything becomes significant. In modern Nintendo games, interestingly newer Mario games often provide more generous life systems while preserving challenges in other ways. Super Mario Odyssey gives death a monetary penalty instead of traditional life counter. Nintendo designer Yoshiaki Koizumi explains this evolution. We wanted to maintain the challenge without interrupting the player's flow. Losing coins creates a consequence that stings without stopping your momentum. This shift reflects changing player expectations and gaming context. When games were primarily played in short sessions at arcades, the hard reset of losing all lives made sense. Maintaining player flow becomes more important in modern consoles games designed for longer sessions. Celeste offers infinite attempts but focuses on micro challenges and tracks death counts. Developer Matty Thorson says, we wanted to remove the punishment of limited lives while preserving the emotional impact of failure and the satisfaction of eventual success. Games like Celeste represent perhaps the most interesting evolution. They maintain the emotional core of the three-life system while eliminating the structural frustration of having to repeat large gameplay sessions. This approach acknowledges that the primary value of punishment mechanic isn't the punishment itself, but the emotional engagement that comes from meaningful risk. Hollow Knight uses the soul recovery system similar to Dark Souls but integrates it into the narrative and geography. Designer William Palin says, the shade mechanic ties failure to the game's theme of reflection and confronting one's past. You have to face your previous stuff. This demonstrates how modern games often integrate punishment mechanics into thematic and narrative elements rather than treating them as purely structural systems. Hades uniquely incorporates failure into its narrative, with protagonist Zagreus commenting on each death and returning to the House of Hades. Where the story progresses, creative director Craig Casavin explains that we wanted to solve the narrative dissonance of repeated failure by making death a narrative beat rather than a punishment, which transformed the traditional failed state into a story progression. This represents perhaps the most complete reimagining of the punishment system. Failure becomes not just mechanically integrated but narratively essential. Game designer Jesse Shell in The Art of Game Design observes how player expectations have shifted. Modern players often expect challenge without complete roadblocks. The question designers now face isn't whether to punish failure, but how to make failure itself instructive and engaging. This evolution reflects broader culture shifts in how we view learning and mastery. Educational theorist Carol Dweck's research on growth mindsets finds that viewing failure as a learning opportunity rather than a final judgment produces better outcomes, a philosophy increasingly reflected in game design. Game accessibility advocate Ian Hamilton notes, the trend towards more flexible punishment systems isn't about making games easier. It is about making the challenge more meaningful and accessible to diverse player groups with different skills and available time. Many modern games now offer adjustable difficulty settings that specifically modify punishment mechanics, allowing players to customize the risk-reward balance to their preference while maintaining the core gameplay experience. Interestingly, telemetry data from games with adjustable difficulty shows that most players prefer some form of meaningful consequence for failure, not those that feel arbitrary or excessively punitive. Game analytics researcher Anders Drachen found players typically don't want the absence of challenge, they want a fair challenge with clear feedback and reasonable recovery mechanics. This suggests that Mario's three-life system wasn't just a technical or economic solution but tapped into something fundamental about how humans engage with challenges and learning. Mario's three-life system may seem like a simple convention, but as we've seen, it sits at the intersection of business necessities, technical constraints, psychological principles, cultural symbolism, and the game design philosophy. From the coin-operated arcades of the 80s to the psychological nuances of risk and reward, the three-life system represents a fascinating study of how games mechanics shape player experience. The evolution of this system across gaming history tells us something important about both games and human psychology. We want challenges that matter, but we also want reasonable opportunities to overcome them through learning and adaptation. Whether you're a game designer considering how to structure your challenge systems, or simply a player curious about why games work the way they do, the humble Life's Counter offers profound insights into the art and science of interactive entertainment. The enduring appeal of this system and its many modern variants speaks to a fundamental truth. Games aren't just about fun or distraction. They are about engaging with challenges in meaningful ways that mirror our real-life experiences of struggle, learning, and growth. The next time you see Mario shrink and fall after touching a Goomba, remember, you are not just losing a life, you are participating in a carefully crafted experience that balances difficulty with opportunity, tension with relief, and failure with the promise of eventual success. After all, there's always another mushroom out there, another chance to get it right. And isn't that what games and life are all about?